He worked as an analyst and an associate in the European Structured Finance Group within the Investment Banking Division of Goldman Sachs International in London. He was also a principal in the Corporate and Institutional Clients Department at Standard Chartered Bank and served as a special advisor to the Nigerian Minister of Finance, focusing on capital markets, power, and infrastructure. He is a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Lanre Olutimilehin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think initially it was supposed to be good morning, but with the time we have, I will try to run through these slides fairly quickly. I will stand on existing protocols. Your Excellencies, the President of the NISV, Chairman of the NISV Lagos Group, Lagos Chapter, all the speakers, and the fantastic papers. Thank you for your fantastic papers. I'm very humbled to be able to deliver this to you. And I also want to thank all my family, friends, and colleagues who are here today. So today, I'm going to speak on housing, which is critical infrastructure for Nigeria's economic future. I want to say a happy birthday to, am I permitted to call you GF? Once again, GF, happy birthday to you. You are an inspiration to all of us. Everyone knows what housing is. A bit like Nigeria, everyone has a view on what to do. In fact, there are university courses and degrees dedicated to housing. So all I'm going to do is to try to draw out a few things that I hope you'll be able to take away with you this afternoon. Okay, to begin with, what is infrastructure? Infrastructure is the services and facilities that help to uplift economic activities and growth of a country or region by facilitating better productivity. Infrastructure is crucial for a nation's economic and social development, and it also helps to improve its people's quality of life. When Prof was speaking, he talked about economic development and not just economic growth. And I had to quickly check my slides to make sure I put in economic development there and not just economic growth. So, infrastructure has a lot of linkages to the economy, and they are multiple and complex. They impact production and consumption, and they create positive and negative externalities. So externalities are the side effects of the primary effect of the infrastructure, and these things are benefits to households, benefits to enterprises, lowering of costs, which eventually lead to growth and development. So infrastructure is not the engine of growth, but it is the wheels of economic development. And what is infrastructure? Many people recognize infrastructure in terms of physical infrastructure. So roads, bridges, airports, rail, power, communication. But you have hard infrastructure and you have soft infrastructure. Soft infrastructure is in the form of things like schools and hospitals. Okay, I cannot, okay. So it's in the form of hard infrastructure which directly impacts production, and those are the things that many people really understand to be infrastructure. And you have the soft infrastructure which indirectly impacts production, and these are things like the essential services that achieve social goals, and they indirectly contribute to the country's economic development. Now, infrastructure evolves as a region's economic growth continues. So at the left hand of the spectrum, you have what is survival, the basic infrastructure that is needed for society. And that is that is where basic housing is. And then as you go along, you have your you have your more advanced infrastructure, and then at the end of it, you have the quality of life items, that target what people need in terms of quality of life. So Nigeria kind of straddles that middle bit. I mean, we have some housing, we have power, we have mass transit, we have some of these things. But the reality is that as you go along and as a region develops, the level of infrastructure is also enhanced. So, does infrastructure really impact economic growth or economic development? Yes, I think we can say it does. Academic research from the World Bank, who conducted a literature review of various studies on the impact of infrastructure on economic growth, say it. And I think, we can all agree that the introduction of 3G coverage, digitization boosted employment and economic growth in Nigeria. We can agree that electricity access leads to structural transformation and human development. And we know that transport infrastructure is critical for market access and work. So I think anecdotally we know, and we instinctively know, that infrastructure is good for the economy. Again, another definition about infrastructure and its criticality. And this is from the US Department of Homeland Security. So the physical and cyber systems and assets that are vital to the United States, so that their incapacity on destruction would have a debilitating impact on the physical or economic security of public health and safety of their nation. That is what is called critical infrastructure. And I think we can agree that if there's a lack of safe, affordable, and adequate housing, there's going to be a negative impact on the security, health, economic well-being, and development of the people. So, is housing infrastructure? Well, yes, they share many similar characteristics. They're real assets. The investment horizon is longer for infrastructure investment, but it is long for housing as well. In terms of cash flow, they are fairly predictable. In terms of risk profile, for infrastructure, I would say relative to housing, it's a bit lower. In terms of correlation with the markets, again, infrastructure lower, housing moderately correlated. As an inflation hedge, it's very strong with infrastructure, only partial with housing. The social impact is good on both. They are both quite regulated. And in terms of liquidity, infrastructure investment is relatively more illiquid than housing. So they share similar characteristics. But is housing still infrastructure? So it's not often viewed as de facto critical infrastructure in public policy, but it's a fundamental component of how communities are built and how cities are shaped. So it's at the nexus of the physical, the social, and economic elements of a society. And it's where the community meets with households. It also plays a central role in mitigating social and economic vulnerabilities. So in summary, housing is where jobs go to sleep at night. And affordable housing is where essential jobs go to sleep at night. Essential jobs, those are the jobs that keep the cities running. Those are the jobs that keep everything going. And the other thing is that when you add a job to your urban economy, you're adding a home. So you cannot think about creating jobs without creating homes as well for those jobs. Also, when you add a high-value job or a high-income job, There's a rule of thumb from the Affordable Housing Institute. I'm just adopting it, which says that for every high-income job you create about 5 mid to low-income jobs. So those are the support staff, the drivers, the maid. So you have to think about how those people will be housed. So I think you would agree that housing is definitely infrastructure. This is a long and detailed slide, but what this is saying is that definitely housing and economic development are linked. Housing aids capital accumulation. So what does that mean? It's good for the government. It boosts government revenue in terms of taxes, and that allows for income redistribution. The jobs created from housing and from construction means more income opportunities. If that money is spent, it leads to more job creation. If it's saved, it is domestic savings that can be mobilized for other activities. So a well-developed housing finance system is a source of mobilizing financial resources for development. And this slide is really just talking about the previous slide. When you are building, you construct. There's a ripple effect from construction, and there's an ongoing impact from the occupied homes. And what does this mean? All this is income for government. There's taxes, there are benefits for the economy, and there's spending and consumption. And there's a study from the US, from the US National Association of Home Builders, which said that in a typical city in the US, or typical city in the US, a US location, 100 single-family housing units created, generated or supported 394 jobs, and led to 69 jobs on an ongoing basis. Now, this doesn't, I mean, obviously that's the US, which is a much more developed housing market. But if we were to extrapolate and transcribe, it means that if you are going to deliver 1 million homes annually, and we'll come to that later, perhaps it's going to create more than 2 million jobs across different sectors of the economy in Nigeria. Real estate, services, construction, retail trade, finance, insurance, the mortgages, the insurance, house insurance, all those things. Those are jobs that are supported by the housing industry. And in terms of real estate and construction, they form a significant part of the GDP of the country, currently about 9% of economic output. And when we compare that with other countries, there's room. So there's room for that to grow. There's room to add to the country's GDP. So where has this worked? I think the most famous example of a very fully developed housing system that has grown over decades is the United States, where following World War II, the housing market was jump-started and various institutions were built to support the housing market. And the government played a role as well in building the necessary underlying infrastructure to support home ownership and to support home building. So it was a big part. I mean, housing is closely linked to the American dream that we hear so much about. So let's bring it back a little. This is a quote from this book written or compiled by the African Development Bank, which says on housing market dynamics in Africa. And it says most governments are facing huge housing deficits, which is a time bomb waiting to explode, and that there is a need to provide housing at scale and in a sustainable manner. I think we can all agree with this. Earlier on, Prof also talked about the state fragility indices. And across sub-Saharan Africa, this is an issue, this is important, and this is something that we need to think about as well in Nigeria. So, in terms of the housing problem in Nigeria itself, there are various estimates of what the deficit is. The Center for Affordable Housing Finance puts the current level of the deficit at 28 million homes. There are various estimates and various ways that that is estimated. But some analysis has shown that we need to deliver about 1 million homes annually to bridge that deficit. And that is versus the current level of supply, which is probably just under 100,000 units developed annually across Nigeria right now. So what is Nigeria doing? Well, the current administration has an 8-point economic reform agenda. They are listed there. And the delivery of housing will speak to at least 5 of these things: ending poverty, creating jobs and economic growth, access to capital, which will be needed, inclusivity, and improving security. And one can argue that the rule of law would be improved and that we can fight corruption a bit better if housing is delivered to Nigerians. And so they are making an effort. There's the Renewed Hope Cities and Estates, which is looking to deliver 50,000 housing units over a period of time. Note that this is against the 1 million that is estimated that Nigeria needs annually. Now, thinking about housing as infrastructure, recently the Federal Executive Council approved an initiative to transform Nigeria's infrastructure and housing sector through private partnerships, to unleash 2 trillion in long-term financing for housing and infrastructure projects nationwide. And it's interesting that housing and infrastructure are considered to be on the same playing field by this administration. This created a lot of controversy. People are concerned about their pensions. Indeed, the CEO of the Pension Operators Association of Nigeria is here, and he can probably speak to that. So there are concerns, but because this is a source of a lot of capital that can really, truly unleash the delivery of housing in Nigeria, it's a discussion that must be had, and this is a very good initiative from the current administration. In terms of the housing ecosystem, yes, there is one. It's complex. This is taken from the housing strategy, the 10-year housing strategy paper that was put together by the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing. And it's complex, and there are institutions that have been created to start to deliver this housing. They're working. We need to think about how to enable them to get the results that they need and to fulfill their mandates. So where are we going? We want to go from the picture at the top left hand to the bottom right hand, which is safe, well-built, sustainable housing for as many people as possible. And interestingly, these are some of the images of cities globally where, with economic growth, housing has been built, but it sits side by side with informal housing and with slums. So top left and bottom left, that's Mexico. Top right is Durban in South Africa. And the bottom right is interesting. It's South Korea. This is a slum in South Korea, and we need to have well-priced or sustainably, suitably priced mortgage loans or home financing. You can see that 65% of the respondents to that survey needed or had a preference for mortgage financing to support their purchases. And on the supply side, we need to have well-priced, affordable homes. So, this is a framework that's put together by the Affordable Housing Institute. In a functioning market, the supply and demand side will meet at closing. So, the demand side will turn effective demand into a financed loan. and the supply side will turn an unbuilt place into an occupiable home. And each step, there are many actors, there are many people involved in these chains, and each step relies on the other, both on the demand and the supply side. And if one link is broken, it doesn't work. You have a market that does not function. So when we look at developers, developers will continue to look for opportunities. They will build homes to meet the need, and they will price those homes to match the market. So if the market that's available for them or the effective demand is focused on the high end, that is where, unsurprisingly, developers will focus on. So the government plays an outsized role in the housing market. It influences supply and demand. And what they can do is to enable, incentivize, regulate, discourage, and disable. But whilst they have that role, the private sector will continue to drive housing development and housing finance. Affordable housing that we all talk about costs money, and there's a subsidy, whether it's visible or invisible. If it's on the supply side, it's reflected in the cost of homes, and if it's on the demand side, it's reflected in the cost of money. And I think the question for us is how much affordability can we afford in Nigeria? So what are some solutions that we can look at in terms of delivering housing or affordable housing and supporting this critical infrastructure? Well, firstly, I think we need to build developer capacity. It's a high-risk enterprise. And in Nigeria, I mean, there are a lot of risks to manage. There's planning risk, title risk, infrastructure risk, construction risk, offtake risk. So we need to build the capacity of developers to manage these things. The developers need financing in the form of debt and equity. And we need to move away from only funding or supporting the biggest developers. Smaller entities need funding as well. Development requires knowledge and skill. So developers also need to build up their knowledge and skill base. The other concern is that if we're talking about affordable housing, the development profit on affordable housing is low. And so in order to make it work, and in order for it to be attractive for developers, you need concessions, and those may be concessions on land, and those may be concessions on land or on funding. Another thing is that we need to think about encouraging mission entrepreneurial entities that are focused on housing, and I'll talk about that later. Okay. Financing is important. There's no way to build affordable housing when debt levels, the price or the cost of debt financing is so high. It's priced at 30% or more, which means that the equity side is also more expensive. It's short tenor, and that puts a limit on mortgage funding or the effective demand. So we need to allow or have specialized lenders such as PMIs who can understand property risk, but they also need to be capitalized and funded. The 25% RSA equity contribution that was put in place recently is a step in the right direction towards unlocking the capital for housing finance. And capital markets ultimately provide the solution, but the problem is the cost for now. So in the interim, the cost is the issue. So for affordable housing, for now, risks are not well understood. So the capacity to underwrite, credit assess, and risk manage investments is important. In terms of planning, urbanization is set to continue. There is no way, I think when you look at the demographics now, it says that 40% urbanized, 60% rural in Nigeria. So it's going to continue, it's not going to stop. Okay, I'm being shoved off, which is good because it means less questions for me. So we need to create mixed income communities. And so I think it's important to legislate for minimum levels of affordable housing within market-driven developments. We need flexibility in zoning and density regulations in urban centers. to encourage mid-rise housing. We also need to plan for trunk infrastructure to open up developable land. Before I was speaking to Engineer Otola, and he was saying that we need to look at something called transit-led development. I'm not sure I've got that right. But that is what opens up neighborhoods and creates new cities. And we also need to think about the amenities that are needed in the developments we create. Commercial, retail, educational, and health facilities that are in close proximity to these developments. All these things will eventually boost tax revenues for the government and help them to recover the capital they will need to put into funding these affordable homes. We need to look at the local manufacturing of building materials. I think that's self-explanatory. We also need to think about how we encourage affordable housing development. We talked about the developers. So the developers are there, but the developers are going to focus where there's profit for them. If we want affordable housing, either the government has to do it or someone who doesn't want to take profit will do it. So MEES are mission entrepreneurial entities that are non-profits, and what they want to do is make an impact. There are many that focus on housing, and some of them historically were endowed by wealthy patrons. You have, in the UK, you have things like the Guinness Partnership, the Peabody Trust, Clarion Housing, and what they do is they provide housing or non-market housing for rent to meet, and it's affordable to meet and close that housing gap. And some of them sustain their activities by doing and developing market-based housing and developments as well. We also need to encourage the growth of cooperative societies, because that's also an important means of home ownership for many people. Okay, so I will conclude now. So firstly, housing must be an integral part of a national infrastructure strategy, and it's heartening to see that this is how it seems to be thought of by this current administration. Affordable housing costs money. This money has to be sourced from somewhere, and a big part of that the government really needs to be involved in that. Government participation in the demand and supply value chain is crucial, and we must enhance the capacity of strategic stakeholders in the value chains. So, to conclude, finally again, we know that housing is not a commodity. We know it's a human right. And if we're going to have a healthy society and a safe society, we need to recognize that it is critical infrastructure. And affordable housing in particular is very important. We need to think about how to fund it, how to develop the capacity for it, and how to build it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lanre Olutimilehin. We can do better than that. Thank you very much. I really wish time was our friend, but the time keeps speeding very fast. I wish we could hold it down. So because of that, I'm afraid we'll not be able to take too many questions. So we'll take questions, maybe one question per speaker, one question for Mr. Olutimilehin, and one question for the previous speaker, Mr. Gbenga Olaniyan. So if we have our questions written down, do we have any questions? Yes, sir, I'll take a question. Who is your question directed towards, sir? Okay, all right. Both of them. So you've combined the two in one. Thank you, sir, for helping us to save time. Okay, can you have the microphone, please?